In this video, I want to compare taking the square root of a positive number with taking the square root of a negative number. So of course we know the square root of 16 is going to be 4, but how does that compare with the square root of negative 16? Well, what I'm going to do here is rewrite this square root of negative 16 as the product of the square root of negative 1 with the square root of 16. And by dividing this up into two pieces, I can tackle each piece separately. So the square root of negative 1 we know is I, and the square root of 16 we just said was 4. So we can write this now as 4i, and we've written this in appropriate standard form, a plus bi, where the I comes last. Okay, well, how about looking at the square root of something that's not a perfect square? So let's go ahead and tackle the square root of 45 and the square root of negative 45. Okay, well, I know I can simplify radicals fairly easily by finding first its prime factorization. Okay, so I can now rewrite the square root of 45 as 3 times 3 times 5 underneath that radical. And I'm trying to simplify it by taking out perfect squares. Well, 3 times 3 is 9, which is a perfect square. So this being a pair will come out, and this simplifies down to 3 times the square root of 5. Well, okay, well, how does that compare with the square root of negative 45? Well, like we did in the previous example, I'm going to rewrite this as the product of the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 45. And then we can once again tackle these separately. The square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 45 is 3 radical 5. So how should I write this final piece, though, the product? Well, to be in standard form, I need to write it in a plus bi form. So 3 times the square root of 5i seems to be the most appropriate way to write this. But the problem a lot of students have is when they write it this way, they get a little sloppy or lazy with their radical here, and sometimes the radical extends past, and we're not sure if the I is under the radical or not under the radical. So another way to write this to kind of take away the ambiguity is we'll write 3i times the square root of 5. And either one of these is appropriate, but I'm just telling you why sometimes you'll see the 3i times the square root of 5 when you might ask yourself, why is that I not at the end? Well, that's why, because we're trying to limit the amount of, confusion we have as to whether the I is under the radical or not under the radical. But there's the difference between taking the square root of a positive number and the square root of a negative number.